Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's 2 p.m. local time, and we are going to get started in a few minutes. However, while we wait for everyone to log on, we want to learn a little bit more about you, our audience. So please tell us via the chat box where in the world you will be joining us from and where in the US you would like to intern. I'll start. My name is Fatima Rodriguez, and I'm the Communications and Recruitment Coordinator here at InterExchange for the Career Training USA program. I'm joining from New York City, and I'm also joined by my colleague, Abigail. I'll actually let you introduce yourself as we kick off this presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abigail Grazel, and I'm the Participant Services Coordinator at InterExchange with the Career Training Department. And I am joining today from Maine in the US.
Awesome. Thanks, Abby. So we've got some people from the audience chiming in. We have Kiara from Germany who wants to do an internship in New York. Then we also have David from Colombia who wants to do an internship in San Francisco for a business administration internship. Laura from Ireland who wants to do an internship in Chicago. In public administration. So it seems like there's a lot of different types of people from all around the world who want to do different kinds of internships and interning in different areas in the United States. So we're actually really excited to bring this webinar series to you. It's the 8th of 10 webinars that we will be conducting this fall. This series of webinar has covered everything from searching for an internship in the United States to creating cover letters and resumes, updating your LinkedIn profile, basically all of the aspects of submitting a successful international internship application. So for those of you who aren't familiar with InterExchange or Career Training USA, we're a nonprofit organization based in New York City, and our mission is to promote cross-cultural exchange for students overseas to come to the United States and also for students in the US to go overseas and partake in programs. The Career Training USA program particularly works with students who have internships and are looking to come to the United States to do an internship or a traineeship. With that, obviously, with the pandemic, there has been less opportunity for people to come and travel and experience internships in person or in other countries. But we know that there's still a lot of interest in these types of programs and interning in the United States, especially with a lot of travel bans lifting. So we want to provide the resources that we can during this time, now that people are thinking about interning, but may not be ready to come to the United States at this point. So we hope that this topic today will help you to think about, different intercultural communications and what it's like to work in a US office culture. Additionally, just a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to Abby to begin the presentation. Everyone is muted, so if you have any questions, just please type it into the chat box and we'll read them off as they come in if they're pertaining to that portion of the presentation. However, we do have a question and answer section at the end of the webinar. So if there's something you'd like to ask that isn't related, we can talk about those questions later. And if you are joining us a little late or you have to leave the session early, this webinar will be recorded and everyone who is registered will get a recording of this session. So with that, Abby, I'll turn it over to you to get started with the presentation.
Thanks so much, Fatima. So as Fatima said, we want to provide you with resources if you're planning to come to the US for an internship or a traineeship in the near future. So maybe you've already found an internship or are preparing for your arrival. Wherever you are in the process, we're happy you're here. This webinar will help you make the most out of your time in the US by developing your intercultural communication skills and showing you what to expect in your US office. So if we go through and look at the outline of the session, Fatima, I think maybe your screen is paused. There we go. So if we look at what we're going to talk about today, we'll start by kind of detailing and discussing exactly what intercultural communication is. We'll then go on to talk about different aspects of communication that can vary between cultures. Then we'll give you some tips for communicating across different cultures. And we'll end today's session with some tips and information about US office culture specifically, so that you can be prepared to come to the US and do your internship. So before we do jump into the presentation, I want to give you a disclaimer about COVID-19 and how it is affecting communication and the topics that we'll be discussing today. It's important to remember that communication does change and evolve over time, and COVID-19 has forced a lot of changes to happen very quickly. For example, many more people are doing remote work than they did in the past. There's a lot more video communication. Maybe everyone is still social distancing. There's no handshakes, for example. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today, they may have been the norm, more normal before COVID, before the COVID pandemic. But it's important to remember that not everything will return to normal once COVID-19 has passed. So we will still need to adapt and change as we all continue to get used to these new ways of communicating. So throughout the presentation, I will try to mention ways that perhaps COVID-19 has had an impact on a particular aspect of communication that we're talking about. So what makes up a country's culture? So if you think about a country that maybe you visited once, or one that you maybe want to visit, what are some of the first things that you think about when you think of this country? What parts of their culture come to mind? So this is kind of a fun introduction to just thinking about culture in general. So type some of your thoughts into the chat bar. What do you think about first when you think of a country's culture? So I'll give an example first of some things that I think about. A lot of times when I think of a country's culture, I think of their food or their drink first. Maybe I think of music or dance second. So for example, if I think of Spain, that makes me think of good food, some really good wine, and flamenco. I really like flamenco, so that's really iconic of Spanish culture for me. What are some things that you think of? I'll give you just a second to type some things in, and hopefully we'll get some answers of some other countries' cultures. Fatima, have we had any answers come in?
Yes, so we actually have Kiara. She says that she thinks of the Eiffel Tower when she thinks of France. And then we also have Shelley, who thinks about fireworks and the 4th of July every time she thinks about the United States. So it seems as if like landmarks and some popular holidays related to certain countries they think about.
Great. Yeah, that all makes sense. I think that, fireworks here in the US for the 4th of July is pretty iconic as well in terms of our culture. Maybe you think of the food that Americans eat on 4th of July, which is often barbecue or hot dogs, that sort of thing. So often when we think of culture, we do think of kind of the surface level. So if we go to the next section of this slide, we will take a look at the cultural iceberg. So this will show you kind of everything you first think of when you think of culture. So we have the food, the dress, the music, arts, language. That's kind of surface culture. But as you can see, cultural rules and ideologies impact almost all aspects of our lives and how we see the world. And so within this cultural iceberg, if you look underneath the water line there in this picture, you see all different kinds of aspects of culture that affect everyone and how they see the world. So deeper cultural influence can affect notions of leadership, ideals of how to raise a child, the nature of friendship, the concepts of past and future. So it does have a greater impact on almost all areas of our lives. So hopefully this brief visual, I do really like this visual because it's a great example of the different parts of culture and just how prolific it impacts the entirety of our lives. You can see why learning about culture in general is so important, just from this brief image of exactly what culture is. Okay, so what exactly is intercultural communication? So I want to start by first defining communication in general. So communication isn't just about speaking to someone and having them understand your language. Information must be interpreted by the listener in the way that you're intending them to interpret it. So communication is the mutual creation of meaning. So for example, if you think about a time you told a story and you referenced a movie, if your listener hadn't seen that movie, then they wouldn't fully understand the point that you're trying to make with that story and that reference. So in order to have full understanding and communication, your listener has to understand and interpret your examples or exactly what you're speaking about in the same way that you're intending them to. So it's kind of a joint effort to get to full communication. So as we talked about in the last slide, what is culture? Someone's culture can be thought of as their worldview. It is the norms and beliefs of a group of people. And as we saw, it can impact how someone behaves and communicates. It can impact core beliefs and the way you see the world. So it has a great impact on all aspects of life. So good intercultural communication is the mutual creation of meaning across cultures. So if we combine those two that we just defined, we'll get to intercultural communication. So that means you try to understand the intentions of others from another culture in a non-judgmental way. So you try to get to their core beliefs and kind of understand where they're coming from and the best way to communicate with them. So why should you learn about intercultural communication and try to improve your skills? Not only will it help you when you come to the US to do your internship, maybe you'll learn more, you'll build better relationships, that sort of thing. But building these skills now can also help you in your job search in the future. Business is increasingly global. The chances that you will have to work or interact with someone from another culture is very high. So it's important that you have those good intercultural communication skills so that you are more successful in the workplace, both at your internship and after. It is important to remember that sometimes cultural misunderstandings have been known to lead to failed mergers. Being able to have good intercultural communication skills is something you can, advertise to future employers to tell them, hopefully you won't have any full failed mergers because of misunderstandings across culture. And, having good intercultural communication skills will also make you a better coworker. Your colleagues might have different professional norms, beliefs, communication styles, all of those things. So understanding those differences can help your team have better rapport. It can just make you a better coworker, easier to work with. All of those are important. COVID-19 has also really affected this and its importance. Remote work has changed business in general and made intercultural communication even more important. The chances that you're going to communicate with someone from another place, across video chat in a meeting is much higher now as many more people are doing remote work. And it is important to remember that communicating via video is different than communicating in person. So it's just another layer of communication skills that you'll need to focus on and try to advance and improve upon. So let's move on. Now that we've kind of defined intercultural communication and why it's important, let's talk about the different aspects of communication and how they can differ across cultures. So we're going to talk about just a few aspects. There are a lot, but there's a few that we'll talk about today, including verbal communication, direct and indirect communication, formal and informal cultures, time orientation, and body language. So let's start with verbal communication. And this is the most obvious form of communication, but it's not just about language, the language that is being spoken and understanding that. There are different aspects of verbal communication that you'll also want to notice and think about. So you want to notice the way the local language is being spoken and adapt yourself accordingly. So, the tempo or the pace, how quickly someone is speaking, that can differ across languages and across cultures, for example. Americans often speak very quickly. I hope I'm not speaking too quickly for you now, but someone from another country may speak slower than me, for example. Spanish is sometimes spoken naturally more quickly than English as well. So, the pace of a speaker can vary depending on where you are, what language you're speaking, who you're speaking with. Another aspect of verbal communication to consider is the amount of silence between speakers. How comfortable are people with silences in a conversation? You might notice in the US, for example, Americans don't like silence in conversations. It does often make us uncomfortable. And there's often jokes, you may have heard them in movies or TV, about awkward silences. That's because they make us feel uncomfortable in our culture. So you might notice that Americans might finish speaking immediately, they might start speaking immediately after you finish, or maybe even before you finish speaking. They like a quick pace of conversation. They don't want to have any awkward silences. They're going to start speaking immediately after you. That might not be true in other countries, other languages. They may be more comfortable with more silence and have a slower communication style. And then you'll want to pay attention to the use of idioms. Some cultures may use more idioms than others. Americans, for example, are known to use a lot of idioms. If you're not sure what an idiom is, I do recommend tuning into our webinar next week. We'll specifically talk about English in the US office, and you can learn exactly what an idiom is and learn more about the idioms that you might encounter in the office here in the US. So direct and indirect communication. These are two different types of communication styles, two different types of culture almost, for example. So direct communicators, they get to the point quickly. They want to convey information more than they may worry about feelings. On the opposite side are indirect communicators. So they may imply or suggest the meaning of their words. They usually prefer to maintain harmony, and they may not say what they mean outright. So Americans usually are direct communicators. They usually state very clearly what they want or they mean. In the US, especially in the office and at work, we prefer to keep some emotional distance. So we might, from others, especially our coworkers, so we may be more blunt with our words, more direct, telling you exactly, what we mean. So depending on your home country's communication style, this may come across as rude or aggressive. And if it's not something that you're used to, it might be something that you have to become familiar with when you first arrive in the US. If you look here, we do have a quote from a previous intern from South Korea. If you see what she quoted here, when it comes to expression, Americans are willing to speak out their thinking or how they feel without hesitation, whereas Koreans usually walk on eggshells when they talk about their thinking and decision. So this quote clearly shows a difference between maybe Americans' communication style and South Koreans' communication style, which for her, when she first arrived, was a bit of a shock, a culture shock that she had to get used to, because it is different from where she's from, where maybe in South Korea, they're a bit more of indirect communicators. So if we move on to talk about formal and informal cultures, these can really affect the communication style of, different cultures as well. So you'll want to kind of read up and find out if a culture you're visiting is formal or informal. So the ways you can tell this is to first pay attention how people greet each other. You know, are handshakes used? Do maybe people bow when they greet each other? You know, what are the cultural norms for greetings? Maybe in Europe, sometimes you kiss someone on the cheeks. So there are a lot of differences depending on the formality of the culture, how everyone greets each other. In the US, handshakes are common in business settings. Obviously, right now, this has changed due to COVID-19. Some people may have started doing handshakes again. Others maybe are a little bit more wary and try not to do handshakes, which is totally fine. Some people might just be bumping elbows instead of handshaking, or maybe you nod to each other from a distance. So that is a little bit different now, just something to keep in mind. Another way you can tell someone's if they're formal or informal culture is to pay attention to the use of titles. So how often are titles such as Dr., Mr., Mrs., how often are they used? Do you use them when you first meet someone? Do you use them with someone always? You know, are first names used right away? You know, that can give you a clue as to the formality of the culture and how you should approach someone in a conversation. And often this is impacted by a culture's views on power. So, you know, if someone has a different view of power, some cultures have figures of authority, you know, in highly respected positions. You know, maybe they have a little bit more authority. There's a bit more of a distance between those of authority and those without authority. Or is there more of a flat power structure with less of a social distance between those who are in charge? So Americans, for example, tend to be more informal. First names are commonly used even with people you've only just met. So, you know, in the US office, for example, you might just be introduced to everyone by their first name, and that's how you speak to them. There's often always more of a flat power structure as well, especially depending on the industry you're going into. You know, tech companies are often known to be really informal, you know, more of a flat power structure, less respect for authority. So, you know, something to keep in mind culture-wise, but also office culture-wise and the type of industry that you're coming into. And if you see, we have another quote here that someone was surprised how quickly and easily it was to say hello to someone that they've never met before. Americans do tend to do more small talk and say hello to those they're only just meeting, or they don't know, or they're just passing, seeing in passing. You would still say hello. Okay, let's move on to time orientation. So this is another indicator of culture that you should pay attention to. So how does each culture view time? You know, you want to look at the pace of life. So are people always busy and rushing around? Do they have long meals, or, you know, do they eat quickly at their desk? That'll give you a clue as to the type of culture and what you can expect. So the US, for example, is typically considered to have a fast pace of life. So that usually means, you know, everyone's pretty busy most of the time. You know, there aren't any long lunches, for example. You know, a lot of people eat quickly and then get back to work. Again, though, this perspective will depend on your own country's culture and what you're used to at home. You know, if your country has a really fast pace of life, perhaps maybe Americans' pace of life will seem slow to you. But if you come from a culture with a slower pace of life and you come to the US, it might be a little overwhelming to come to a quicker pace of life. This again might depend on where you're coming in the US. In the cities, life is typically a bit quicker, a bit busier, but if you're coming to maybe a smaller town in the US, you know, the pace of life might be a bit slower. You also want to pay attention to meeting start and end times and how important those are and how, you know, closely they're adhered to. So in some cultures, a stated meeting time is more flexible, and maybe it would be considered rude to arrive on time, for example. The opposite is true in the US. In the US, punctuality is highly valued, so you want to make sure that you don't arrive late to a meeting because everyone expects you to be there at the meeting start time. And finally, time orientation does show up even in written communication. So you want to pay attention to if your coworkers are writing in paragraphs or if they're using bullet points. How are they communicating with others even within their writing? That can show you kind of a slower pace of life, maybe a long paragraph with a lot of description versus a quicker pace of life or a quicker office culture where they're just giving you the bare bones facts through bullet points. So those are all different aspects of time orientation that you'd want to consider. And finally, let's move on to the last aspect of communication we'll talk about today, which is body language. So body language does play a massive role in communication. Personal space, if we'll start with that, personal space is a part of body language. So, how close do you stand to someone while you're having a conversation? What about when you're standing next to a stranger while waiting for the bus? How close you stand to someone in those two situations is going to depend on your culture and what is normal to you based on your own country's culture. So Americans, for example, have one of the largest personal space requirements. So we don't stand too close to each other while we speak. And if you're talking to someone, they may even take a step back from you if they start to feel crowded. Don't be offended if that's what they do. You just want to be observant and use that in the future to kind of be more aware of how close you're standing to someone, especially if you come from a culture with a smaller space requirement than we have in the US. This is especially true right now because of COVID and everyone's trying to social distance. I think some people are going to have an even larger personal space bubble where, they want you to stand even farther away from them because of COVID-19 and safety considerations. So, just be even more aware of how close you're standing to someone these days because it might come across as more disrespectful if you're too close just because of those COVID-19 concerns. And then body language can come across in eye contact as well. So eye contact, for example, in the US is very important. It's how you show your interest in the speaker and how you show that you're paying attention to them. In some other country cultures, it might be considered intense or inappropriate. Maybe it's rude to give too much, have too much eye contact with someone while you're speaking. But in the US, that's something you'll want to think about is more eye contact is generally better so that you show that you're interested in what someone is saying. And then gestures are another body language aspect that can vary across cultures. So a well-known example are hand gestures in Italy. They really help to convey meaning in the Italian culture. In the US, we use maybe fewer gestures, but there are things to consider across all cultures. Different cultures will have different gestures that they would consider rude or inappropriate. For example, in the US, it's considered rude to point at someone, especially if you're talking to your friend at the same time. They'll probably think you're talking bad about them. You're not saying nice things if you're talking and pointing. So just be aware of that, and remember, try not to point to anyone, especially a stranger on the bus. That is considered rude in the US. Okay, so those were all of the aspects of communication that I wanted to discuss and give you some information on today. I do want to go through before we stop for questions and just give you some tips on improving your intercultural communication skills. So The first tip is to have an understanding of difference. So you don't want to assume sameness. So there might be an aspect of your culture that is so ingrained within yourself that you unconsciously assume it is universal. But remember, the way that someone is looking at a situation or a problem may be entirely different from the way you are approaching the same situation. As we saw from the cultural iceberg, culture impacts a vast majority of the way that we live our lives. And sometimes it's easy to forget that other people aren't viewing a situation the same way that you are. So the first tip is just, don't assume that. Just remember that everyone's probably looking at a situation differently. And then you want to be aware of your own cultural biases. So you want to do a little bit of research and recognize the conclusions you unconsciously make and think about how they may be affecting your own perspective and your own communication style. And then you can use that and go and learn about the cultural biases of others. You can kind of learn about the differences between your culture and another culture, and it'll give you a better understanding of how a different culture may be approaching the same situation. And finally, once you've learned about those differences, you want to make sure to be respectful of them. Understanding and respecting differences will go a long way in improving your intercultural communication. And then tip number 2 is to learn about communication styles and adapt. So as we talked about, all cultures have verbal and nonverbal communication, but the style of each can vary greatly. What something means in your home country could mean something entirely different in the US or in another country. As we discussed, norms can vary across cultures, can include personal space, physical touch, physical animation, time orientation. So you're going to want to do your research on your host country before you travel. Read up on politics, sports, geography, watch television shows or movies from your host country. Watching those sorts of shows can give you a lot of information about their communication style. You can look at the body language, you can look at the intonation, you can see the amount of silences that there are in conversations. So just kind of getting that base research in before you depart will help you a lot once you're in country. And then once you are in country, make sure to observe and be attuned. You want to adapt your behavior according to your host culture. So that way you'll have a better chance of being understood. So if you adapt your behavior, then those around you are going to interact with you more positively and understand you better as well. So it's good to do your research before you arrive, but just remember that there is a lot to be learned in country as well, and you can continue to adapt yourself depending on, the new things you learn while you're there. And then the last tip that we have for you to improve your intercultural communication skills is to check your understanding. So take notes during meetings, ask questions if you're unsure of something. Don't be afraid to ask your coworkers for clarification. They're there and they'll probably be very happy to help you and to help explain something that you're unsure of. So just remember that it's a learning process and that you're not going to get it right every time. If you found that you've accidentally offended someone, just make sure to apologize, and then you can use that opportunity to move forward and try again the next time. Okay, before we move on to talk more about US office culture specifically, I do want to stop and see if we've had any questions come in. Fatima?
Yes, there are 2 questions that came in. The first question is, how long should I make eye contact with someone to show my interest in the conversation or interaction?
Yeah, that it's always kind of a juggling act. It's kind of hard, especially if that's not something you're used to. It'll just take you a little while to get comfortable with it. You don't want to stare into someone's eyes the entire time that they're speaking. That does come across as a little intense, maybe a little creepy. So, just make sure to blink normally, maybe occasionally look down, behind them, away. But, always return to looking at the speaker, make brief eye contact and then look away again. But you just want to make sure to make it clear that you're still interested, you're still listening, and that means, returning your gaze to them frequently. Don't worry, you'll get it down with some practice.
Awesome, thanks, Abby. And the second question is, how can I become more aware of my own cultural biases?
Yeah, these can be difficult to know, especially if you've never studied cultural differences before. So you want to start by doing some research and looking for information and analyses of your own culture. There are a number of websites that compare cultures and discuss the important aspects of each. So I'm sure you could find one, look at your own country's culture, and read up on it. By reading about your own culture, you'll learn about yourself, but you can also then use that to compare to other cultures as well. So that way you can kind of have an idea of how your views and values may differ from others from other countries.
Awesome, and that's all the questions so far.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, in that case, let's move on to US office culture, which I know everyone who's hoping to come to the US is excited to talk about. So these are the things we'll talk, the aspects of US office culture we will touch on today. We'll talk about some communication, how you might handle conflict, time, stress, lunch, and socializing. So the US does have an informal business environment, as I briefly mentioned before. This is going to depend a lot on the specific corporate or office culture of your host employer. And as I may have said earlier as well, this will vary by field. So finance, for example, is typically more formal. A technology startup is going to be less formal. So it will depend on your field and the exact office that you're going to. And then again, the differences you're going to notice will also vary depending on your home country and kind of how big of a difference it is between your home country culture and US culture. So US regional differences. Before we go into the specifics about US office culture, I did want to pause to highlight some of the regional differences within the US. The United States is a very large country, and some of the regional differences are great. Some of them will vary a lot depending on where in the US you are going to be. So the expectations for you and for your communication with others will vary depending on where you will be located. So just something to keep in mind is that, the things we're going to talk about today, they may be different depending on which state or city you'll be in during your internship. So the next slide has a map of the US. This map is a slide from Colin Woodward's book, American Nations, a history of the 11 rival regional cultures of North America. So you can read more about his views in the Business Insider article linked underneath the map. I've also linked it in another slide. But basically in his book, he argues that North America can be divided into 11 smaller nations and that the culture of each influences the views of its residents. So for example, if you think about New York City, it's home to millions of people from all over the world. So you may find that New Yorkers are going to be maybe more open or accepting of people from all walks of life. But maybe due to the amount of people, New Yorkers are sometimes considered blunt in their communication style. They're a bit faster pace of life and also just more direct in general, which may come across as rude depending on where you're from. In contrast, if we look down here in the Deep South, those people in the South, they may seem more friendly right away. They may not be as blunt as people from New York. But people from the South may also be a bit more formal and have more of an expectation of respecting authority, for example, or respecting your elders that you might not find in other parts of the country. So, this is just an example of different places within the US and how they may vary depending on where you're going to live. If you're going to be in Miami or Los Angeles, for example, you might hear more Spanish spoken than in other parts of the country. Maybe the pace of life in California might seem slower than in bustling New York. So your expectations for your work life and your office culture should also vary depending on where you're going to be. So make sure to do your research on the region you'll be located in the US to get more specific details of the culture of that region. As I said, we'll link some resources at the end of this presentation to help you with some of that research. And it's also important that once you're here in the US, you also observe what the people around you are doing. And you want to find the most common behaviors and kind of copy those. Just make sure what the majority of people are doing, that's kind of the culture and the behavior you want to emulate. So what does communication look like in the US office? As we discussed before, Americans can be considered very direct, honest, maybe blunt in their communication style. Maybe a colleague might offer you unasked for advice that maybe you aren't used to, or maybe your coworker will send you a very short email with a list of tasks to accomplish. And neither of those are probably meant to be rude. They're just being efficient with their time and their communication. So we also often have casual supervisor relationships in the US. At an informal workplace, the corporate structure may be closer to flat than to hierarchical. So you can probably expect a casual relationship with your supervisor, and they'll expect you to be open and direct with your communication with them as well. So for example, it's acceptable and expected that you'll communicate any issues, questions, concerns directly with your supervisor. More communication can often lead to less misunderstandings. So in a lot of US office cultures, they'll prefer that you're more honest and direct with your supervisor about questions or concerns that you might have. US offices also tend to have a lot of meetings, so just be prepared for some regular meetings. A lot are for planning, analyzing, reviewing projects. There are a lot of different reasons for meetings, but another thing to remember is they're often for open discussion. A lot of times everyone can and is even expected to participate and share their thoughts and their ideas. So it's just important when you're invited to a meeting that you come prepared, you know what the topic is about, and if you need to have, present any information, you're prepared to do so. And then we'll move on to handling conflict. So when you arrive in the US, you should expect that you will need some time to adjust to your new life in the States. So give yourself some time to adapt to your new environment. It can maybe be a little overwhelming at first, especially if it's very different from your own country's culture. So just, give yourself some time to observe and adapt and just settle in. If you are feeling overwhelmed or you have questions or you need extra help, the first step you should always take is to talk with your host employer. Most of the time they will be more than happy to help you. If, on the other hand, you're having problems with your host, if you're having problems with your host, it's usually better for them to hear about your concerns from you before being contacted by us. So it is common practice, as I said before, in the US to address problems and concerns with either your supervisor or the human resources department. By doing so, you and your employer have the opportunity to work together to fix any issues that may arise during your program. If you do have a problem that your employer is unable to address, you should contact InterExchange directly. We are here to help you if that's the case. Hopefully not, but we're here to help facilitate any issues or concerns that you may have. Okay, so time. What are the time expectations in US office? So office hours can vary widely from company to company. Typical office hours are 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., usually Monday to Friday. Some companies may be more flexible. You might be able to choose your hours a bit more depending on the office culture, specifically for your company. So you want to discuss your hours with your HR department or your supervisor so that you know when you're expected to be in the office. Another thing to remember is punctuality. It is very important in the US. So you want to arrive on time in the mornings. You also want to arrive on time to any scheduled meetings. And if you do think you're going to be late in the morning, for example, don't forget to contact your supervisor to let them know. If you're going to be sick one day because you don't feel well and you want to stay home, you do need to contact your HR department or your supervisor to let them know you're not going to come into the office. Basically anything that's going to affect your work schedule, you just need to communicate that with your supervisor and your HR department so that, everyone knows what's going on and when to expect you in the office. Time off might also be a little different depending on what country you're coming from. Employees in the US may get fewer days off than maybe you're used to in your home country. There are a few holidays that most everyone gets off, so a lot of people will get Christmas and Thanksgiving off, but many US employees are only granted 2 weeks of vacation per year, and you may be surprised to learn that some of your coworkers may not even take all of this vacation. So it might be a little bit different. For example, if you're coming from Europe, there's no month-long summer break like you might find in some European cities. Time for vacation is taken off randomly throughout the year, and it may depend on the industry, when you're slow and when you're busy, when you're able to take that time off. So just stay in touch with your HR department, your human resources department, because they'll be able to give you more information about your company policies and your time off policy, and they'll tell you how to request time off as well. Generally, you need to request a vacation, in advance, so maybe a month or so or more in advance. So it's important to know what to expect from your company because that does vary. So talk with your HR department and your supervisor. So what will the dress in the US office look like? So the dress code in your office will vary based on your own company's culture. A lot of offices in the US have moved to more of a casual dress code. So there are a lot of business casual dress codes. Business casual are maybe dress, pants, skirts, blouses. It's not usually a full suit, so often a tie or a jacket aren't necessary for business casual, but a lot of times business casual offices will like you to wear, a button-up shirt or a shirt with a collar. Some companies though have moved to fully casual dress codes. So that usually means jeans, sneakers, t-shirts, all of that sort of thing. So that is something that varies a lot based on your company and the field as well, the industry. So it is important though to remain professional regardless of the dress code in your office. So you don't want to wear anything, too short or low cut. No hats should be worn inside. A lot of times you don't want to wear, flip-flops or jandals or anything like that. So you just want to stay as professional as possible while staying within your company's dress code. A good rule of thumb, a good tip to go by is to keep it business casual at the office for your first few days or weeks. So, wear something nicer the first couple of days, and then you can observe what your coworkers are wearing to kind of get more of a sense of what's appropriate. You can also ask your HR department if you're unsure what you're allowed to wear to the office. We have mentioned HR a few times. Your human resources department will be a great resource for all of the policies in the office. So most likely there's an HR manual or with a list of all of the policies. It's good to review this early on in your internship so you have a better sense of the rules and the culture. You know, the dress code, the office hours, all of that will be listed. So it'll be a great resource for you as you try to navigate your office. Okay, and then I'm going to let this video introduce the next topic, which is going to be lunch in an American office.
Please find a seat and the selection is endless. It's called your desk. And we've just expanded our menu. Come in now and try our live salad eaten while gazing vacantly at a HuffPo article, or our new vending machine pastry hastily scarfed in the middle of a conference call. Wake up your taste buds with a random collection of snacks from the break room, or check out our mayo-covered keyboard, part of our all-new mayo-covered menu, free with any sandwich.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you caught all of that, but it was just a joke video about lunch in the U.S. office and the different foods that people might be eating. So a vending machine, pastry, or pop from the vending machine. You know, getting mayonnaise all over your keyboard because you're eating your sandwich at your desk. That is a joke because it's very common in the US to eat lunch at your desk while you're still working. And I know this is surprising for a lot of interns who are coming to the US, that many of their coworkers will keep working during their lunch break and don't go out and socialize with their coworkers, or they don't take their full hour lunch that they're usually allowed. So just something to keep in mind, as it might be a shock for you when you first arrive. So often a lot of companies give or allow a lunch hour, so a break of an hour where you can eat your lunch. Sometimes you can go to a local restaurant and get takeout. Some coworkers might bring their lunch to the office. But working lunches is certainly a thing in the US. It's very common. We don't encourage you to keep working during your lunch since it's not the most healthy practice. And I know some companies are trying to move away from that because, taking a mental break is healthy and it can make you more productive after the break. But we did want to make sure that working through your lunch is very common in the US, and sometimes it's even expected at some companies. So that video was a great example. There's another old website called Sad Desk Lunch, where people take pictures of their lunch at their desk. So it's a phenomenon in the US for sure of this desk lunch. COVID-19 has also made this more difficult since people don't want to gather as much. A lot of employees are eating lunch alone, often at their desk while they're still working. So COVID-19 hasn't really helped with that problem. But you can talk to your coworkers, kind of get a better sense of what's expected and what everyone does. Some people will ask a coworker to go get lunch with them, and they'll meet up and go to a restaurant or something. But food is often mentioned by past participants as culture shock. So a lot of past interns have been surprised, for example, to see salads eaten at lunch as the main part of their meal. So I know it's something that everyone's really interested in, is food and lunchtime. So just be aware of all the different varieties that you might encounter. Okay, and the last aspect of office culture we'll talk about is socializing. So socializing is very important when you're here in the US and you want to meet your coworkers. Something to remember is that Americans love small talk. So it's not uncommon for coworkers to say hello to each other in the morning, even if you maybe don't know each other that well. It's considered polite to say good morning back and ask how they're doing. Just remember, Americans don't always expect a response to the question, how are you? They often just use that as a greeting in passing. They don't really expect you to give a detailed answer of how you are. Some small talk recommendations to consider to bring up with coworkers are maybe sports, weekend plans, popular television shows, food. There are many different ways that you can have some small talk with your coworkers and kind of try to connect and socialize with them. But remember that Americans do value their privacy, especially in a professional setting. So it's not generally considered appropriate to ask a coworker about their age, their weight, their politics, other personal matters like that. So just be aware of the questions you're asking and try not to ask too many personal questions and stick to the small talk, especially if you're just meeting someone and you're not very well acquainted yet. One way that coworkers do get to know each other better is often at happy hour. Happy hour is a time, usually like 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. or so, when bars offer discounted drinks and food. So a lot of coworkers will get together after work and go grab a drink at happy hour and talk. Just remember not to drink too much. You know, it is a time to be more casual and get to know your coworkers outside of the office, but there is still a level of professionalism that you want to maintain since they are your coworkers. Hopefully this is going to start up again. I know COVID-19 has made happy hour a bit more difficult, but I think as the world is starting to reopen slowly, hopefully happy hours will start up again soon. And then we just wanted to leave you with some US cultural resources. So we hope this presentation has been helpful for you as you prepare for your time in the US. As we discussed, we recommend doing some of your own research, especially on the specific area of the US you'll be visiting. So here are just some lists of articles and resources you can use to get started. The top one is InterExchange's Cultural Compass. You know, in that we have gathered information and resources on each state within the US, so you can learn a bit more about the specific area where you'll be located. So that's kind of where I would start. I recommend you start your research. And yeah, we've reached the end of our presentation. Please type any other questions you might have into the chat box. While you are typing, I wanted to let you know about some of our upcoming webinars. So we will have an English in the US Workplace webinar next week. So we hope you'll be able to join for that. We'll talk about idioms as I discussed. And then our final webinar of this fall is going to be an internship panel of past participants or current participants who will give you some advice for a successful internship. So I did want to see, did we have any questions that came in, Fatima?
Yes, so there are 2 questions that came in. The first question is, what if I will be interning at a small company that doesn't have an HR department?
Sure. So if you'll be at a small company, a lot of times someone in the company will do HR in addition to their other work. So they will have an aspect of their role that deals with some HR issues. So you'll probably want to ask your supervisor or coworkers who the main contact for HR questions is. If there isn't a designated HR department, then it's very important to stay very communicative with your supervisor, since most likely they'll be your main resource for questions or issues. So your supervisor and or someone else who also does HR work. But just remember that InterExchange is also always here to help. So if you have any questions or concerns about your internship, please reach out to us directly so that we can assist.
Thanks, Abby. And the second question is, how do I know if I can go out for lunch?
Yeah, so you can start by asking your supervisor how lunch works at your company. Usually you can go off their answer. So, you know, they'll tell you if you get 30 minutes or an hour or how it works. But you'll also want to gauge kind of the office culture during your first few weeks to see what your coworkers typically do. So if it looks like most people keep working at their desk as they eat, then this may be an unspoken expectation. So you'll want to try to gauge the room to try to see what the general norm is, and then do what you feel most comfortable with. Awesome.
Thank you, Abby.
Is that the last question?
Yes, that is all the questions that came in.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. If you have any final questions, you can always email us, and we're glad you joined us.
Thank you so much, Abby, for that presentation. I'm sure that was so helpful, and you covered so many material over the past hour.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.